I didn't know what possessed me to go. Not really. I suppose that's how all horror stories start, though, don't they? Someone decides to do the thing they know deep down they probably shouldn't. For me, it was that damn envelope. It was plain, yellowed, with a thick, jagged edge as though torn from some old book, and it had no return address. I almost threw it out without a second thought. Junk mail, I figured. But something about it made me hesitate. Maybe it was the weight of it, heavier than paper should feel. Or maybe it was that strange handwriting, scratchy and leaning left, like the writer had been in a hurry or under some kind of pressure. My name was scrawled across the front, and underneath it was a set of coordinates. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to open it. Inside, there was only one line, typed out in black ink. I know what you did. Come to the cabin if you want to know more. The rest was blank. It smelled faintly of old wood and smoke, and it left me feeling both strangely electrified and profoundly unsettled. I couldn't shake the thought that someone knew something about me, something I didn't want known. It took me 3 days to decide. I told myself it was probably just a joke, but deep down, I felt drawn to it. Maybe that's how the devil operates, dangling curiosity on a hook. The coordinates led to a cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere, just north of Lake Tahoe, miles from the nearest town. There was no way to drive all the way there. I parked half a mile away and trekked the rest. The cabin was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. It looked like it had been thrown together from discarded lumber, with a sagging roof and a crooked chimney that puffed out the occasional wisp of smoke. Despite the unsettling vibes, I pushed forward. There were others here, cars parked haphazardly nearby, and lights shining through the cabin windows, casting faint shadows on the snow. I wasn't alone. As I neared the cabin, I could hear voices inside, low and tense, like people were trying to avoid being overheard. I stepped onto the creaky wooden porch and knocked on the door. It swung open before I could even pull my hand back, and a man about my age stood there, tall and thin, with a nervous energy. He looked me over and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Henry," he said, as though he knew me already. His voice had a gravelly edge, like he'd been smoking for years. I gave a quick nod. "That's right. And you?" "Derek." He reached out his hand, and I shook it. His grip was cold, even though the fire inside should have kept the cabin warm. "Come on in. We're all here." "We're all here?" I asked, stepping inside. "How many are we talking about?" "8, including you." The cabin's interior was dim and cramped. It smelled of damp wood and something else I couldn't place, like an earthy scent mixed with something metallic. 7 people sat around a small circular table, all with the same expression, a blend of curiosity, suspicion, and unease. Derek led me to an empty chair and motioned for me to sit. I scanned the room, sizing up the others. There was a man with a thick beard and a woman with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, like she was trying to shrink into herself. Another woman sat with her back straight, looking more irritated than scared, while 2 men sat beside each other, whispering occasionally. "So," I began, looking around, "does someone want to tell me what's going on here?" No one responded at first. They just exchanged glances, as if daring each other to go first. Finally, the bearded man spoke up. "We all got letters, just like you. Some anonymous note saying to come to this cabin if we wanted answers. Most of us don't know each other. At least, I don't think so. But the weird thing is..." He paused, fidgeting with his fingers. "The letter said something specific to each of us, something personal." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. It had felt personal to me, too, as though someone knew me better than I knew myself. The silence in the room grew heavy as the others nodded, confirming what the bearded man said. "Did anyone else think it was a joke?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out strained. "We all did," the woman with crossed arms said, "until we got here and started talking. There's something real going on here." Then Derek cleared his throat. "None of us knew each other before today, but it turns out we all have something in common." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Derek glanced around the table, and when no one else spoke up, he continued. "It's not just that we all got letters. Each one of us has a memory, a secret, that we buried a long time ago. Something we thought no one else knew about." The woman with the straight back, who'd introduced herself as Meredith, spoke up. "But that's impossible, isn't it? Who would know something like that about all of us?" No one had an answer. The silence stretched out until it felt like it was pressing down on us. Then the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. I heard someone gasp. When the lights came back on, a small piece of paper had appeared in the middle of the table. None of us had put it there. Derek picked it up with trembling fingers, holding it up for all of us to see. "One of you isn't who they say they are." The words were written in that same scratchy handwriting as my letter. I looked around the room, feeling the suspicion thickening in the air. Derek placed the note back on the table, his face pale. "This is insane," muttered one of the men, a guy named Alex with a Boston accent. "Someone's messing with us." "Maybe," I said, though even I didn't believe it. Something felt wrong about the whole setup, like we were all puppets in some twisted show. Then Meredith stood up abruptly. "This is a waste of time. I'm leaving." Before anyone could stop her, she moved toward the door, yanking it open. But as soon as she stepped outside, a loud crack echoed through the woods, followed by a sickening thud. We all froze, listening to the silence that followed. "Meredith?" Derek called, his voice shaky. There was no response. One of the other men, a tall guy named Jake, stepped forward and peered outside. His face turned ashen as he slowly backed away, eyes wide. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She's dead," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something snapped her neck." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, and I wasn't the only one. A low murmur of panic rippled through the group. "Someone's out there," the bearded man said. His voice was shaking, but he sounded more angry than scared. "Someone brought us here to pick us off, one by one." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. We weren't just random people in a cabin. We were targets, carefully chosen and brought here under false pretenses. "Who could do something like this?" Derek asked, looking around the room with wide, desperate eyes. The woman with crossed arms, Sarah, leaned forward, her gaze steely. "The question isn't who could do it," she said. "The question is, which one of us invited the rest?" Another silence, this one heavier, and I swear you could hear everyone's heart pounding. One of us was lying, hiding behind the face of a stranger. And now, trapped in this desolate cabin, with a killer lurking outside, or maybe inside. The woods themselves felt like they were closing in, shadows pressing against the thin walls. The fire crackled, its light casting eerie shadows over each of us. I scanned their faces, searching for a sign, a hint, anything that might reveal the truth. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's words hung in the air, unsettling us, each of us grappling with the idea that someone in our midst might have orchestrated the entire thing. Outside, The forest was eerily quiet, as though even the trees were holding their breath. Derek broke the silence first. All right, if we're going to make it through this, we need to stick together. We can't just start pointing fingers, accusing each other. Let's all take a breath and figure out why we're here. There has to be a reason. Sarah scoffed, crossing her arms tighter across her chest. And what do you suggest, Derek? We all just sit around and wait for the next person to end up like Meredith? A murmur of agreement rippled around the room. We were like animals in a cage, each of us wary of making a wrong move. But Derek's face hardened, his jaw clenched. I'm saying we need a plan, he said, his voice steely. Whoever's behind this is counting on us turning on each other. If we want to survive, we have to keep our heads. And what do you propose? I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Derek seemed awfully calm, considering what had just happened. He looked around the room, studying each of us with a steady gaze. First, we need to lock this place down, block the windows, barricade the doors, and no one leaves, not unless we're all together. Second, he hesitated, his eyes flicking to the note in the middle of the table. We need to figure out what we all have in common. Whoever brought us here did it for a reason. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, reluctantly, we all stood up and began pulling what little furniture there was to block the windows and doors. The cabin creaked as we moved, every noise amplified in the oppressive silence. By the time we'd finished, the place felt more like a prison than a safe haven. Once we'd secured the cabin, we gathered back around the table. The firelight cast a sickly glow on everyone's faces, accentuating the shadows beneath their eyes. I could feel the paranoia seeping into my bones, whispering doubts about every face around me. Let's start with the letters, Derek said, sitting back down and glancing at each of us. We all got one, right? We nodded. I pulled my letter out of my pocket, laying it on the table, and the others did the same. 8 identical scraps of paper, each with a similar but chillingly unique message, were spread out before us. The bearded man, Joe, I remembered, picked his up and read it aloud, his voice gruff and uneasy. I know what you did. Come to the cabin if you want the truth. Joe looked around, his eyes haunted. I thought maybe it was a prank, you know? A sick joke. But I couldn't shake the feeling it was real. Each of us read our letters, and the messages were all eerily similar. A line or two hinting at some dark secret, some buried guilt we had each kept hidden. When it was my turn, I felt my throat tighten. My note had been short, but it had hit me like a gut punch. You can't run forever. Come to the cabin if you want forgiveness. The room was silent after I read it, but I could feel their eyes on me, judging, assessing. I wasn't the only one feeling exposed. I saw the same look on everyone else's faces. Whoever had sent those notes had known exactly what buttons to press. So, we all have secrets, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Things we'd rather not admit, things we thought were safe. But why us? And why now? No one answered. The fire crackled in the silence, and I had the unsettling feeling we were being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, sounded like someone, or something, moving closer. Derek cleared his throat. Does anyone remember a time when we could have crossed paths? A job, a place we lived, a shared acquaintance? Anything? We sat in silence, each racking our memories. I could see the others doing the same, their faces twisted in concentration, as though some forgotten puzzle piece might snap into place. I started combing through the mental cobwebs of my past, wondering if there was a thread connecting me to these people, some long-buried tie. But nothing came to mind. Then Jake, the tall guy who had seen Meredith's body outside, leaned forward, his face suddenly pale. Wait, I think I remember. Everyone's eyes were on him now. He swallowed hard, glancing down at the table before meeting our eyes again. About 10 years ago, there was an accident. A car accident on a highway in Utah. Do any of you remember it? A shiver ran through me. Something about his words tugged at a distant memory, a shadowed recollection I'd forced myself to forget. One by one, I saw it on their faces too. Flashes of recognition, fragments of an event we'd each tried to bury. There was a blizzard that night, Jake continued. The roads were icy, almost impassable, but a few cars, including ours, were stuck in a pileup. It was a mess. And then that girl. The words caught in his throat, and I felt my stomach twist. I remembered now. I'd been there. One of the few drivers who'd managed to pull over before hitting the wreckage. There'd been a young woman, trapped in one of the cars, begging for help. But the storm was so fierce, and no one could get to her in time. One by one, I could see it hitting each of us, the flood of memories. We'd all been there that night. Strangers who had stood helplessly in the cold, listening as that girl's pleas grew fainter, until, finally, they stopped. Sarah looked like she was about to be sick. Are you saying that's why we're here? Because we couldn't save her? No, Jake replied, his voice shaking. I'm saying we all left. We all walked away. We didn't stick around for the police. We didn't wait to tell them what happened. We just left her. A heavy silence fell over the room, punctuated only by the faint whistle of the wind outside. The truth was out, a shared sin laid bare. We'd all been there that night, and we'd all run, abandoning the girl to her fate. I felt a crushing weight settle over me, the guilt I'd managed to keep buried for so long, now rising to the surface. Derek broke the silence. So that's it then. Someone knows what we did, and they brought us here to make us pay. Sarah shook her head, her voice breaking. But who? Who would do something like this? As if in answer, the cabin lights flickered again, and this time, when they came back on, there was another note on the table. The words were scrawled in that same jagged handwriting, twisted and cruel. 1 down, 7 to go. A chill raced down my spine as I glanced around the table. The shadows seemed to press closer, thickening the air, making it hard to breathe. Whoever had sent those notes was playing a game with us, and they weren't finished yet. We need to get out of here, Joe said, his voice a low, frightened growl. We need to leave before it's too late. But we all knew the truth. In this storm, in this darkness, there was nowhere to go. We were trapped, forced to face what we'd done. And somehow, some way, one of us, maybe even someone outside, was determined to make sure we paid for it. I hadn't seen any of them in years, not since college, really. We'd all gone our separate ways. Career, family, life in general had taken over, and what had once felt like an inseparable bond had gradually become nothing more than a fond memory. That's why, when Sarah reached out with the idea of a reunion at an isolated cabin in the woods, I'd been more than a little hesitant. But then, the texts had started rolling in, one after the other, like clockwork, and one by one, I could feel myself being drawn back in. Sarah made it sound so simple, a long weekend away from everything, just us, just like old times. We'll have a blast, she'd written. It'll be just like before. When we all piled into the cabin, though, something felt off from the start. Maybe it was the cabin itself. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, it looked more like a hunting lodge than a vacation home. Stark, rough-hewn logs, a weather-beaten roof, and windows that seemed to glare out at the encroaching darkness. The place was silent, too, unsettlingly so. The sounds of the woods, birds, insects, anything, seemed dampened, like they were afraid to get too close. Inside, the silence followed us, thick and cold, interrupted only by the crackle of a fire Sarah had somehow managed to start in the dusty old fireplace. The room had the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, something earthy, almost metallic. Our old group was smaller than I remembered, just 5 of us now. Sarah, with her bright, eager eyes that didn't quite match her nervous energy. Steve, who hadn't said more than a few words since he arrived, staring at the fire like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Josh, who couldn't seem to stop fidgeting, like he'd rather be anywhere but here. Then there was Kelly, who looked as if she'd rather be anywhere too, her arms crossed tight across her chest, like she was keeping herself from running out the door. And then, of course, there was me, feeling like the odd one out, like I didn't quite belong here anymore, even if once, a lifetime ago, I'd been the center of it all. We all tried to make conversation, to laugh and talk about the old days, but it was forced, like we were each waiting for something to happen, something we couldn't quite name. After a while, we gave up. The silence returned, stretching out uncomfortably. That was when Sarah got up and went into the back room. She came back holding something wrapped in a thick cloth. "Look what I found," she said, setting it on the table with a smile that looked more like a grimace. She unwrapped it carefully, as if she were revealing some great treasure. It was an old black and white photograph, the kind you'd expect to find tucked away in an antique store, of a group of people standing in front of a cabin. They were dressed in clothes that looked like they'd been out of fashion for decades. The strangest part was their expressions, blank, eyes hollow, like they were staring straight at us. Steve picked it up and squinted at it. "Who are these people?" "I have no idea," Sarah replied, her voice unnaturally high. "But look closely." I leaned forward, and that was when I noticed it. The figure standing in the middle, a tall man with his arm around a young woman, looked exactly like Steve. Not similar, exactly. It was him, down to the faint scar above his right eyebrow. Josh laughed nervously. "Is this some kind of trick, Sarah? Are you messing with us?" Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "No, I swear, I found it here, just like this. There's more, too." She unwrapped another photo, then another, each one showing a group of people in front of a cabin that looked exactly like ours. And each time, one of us was in the photo. Steve in one, Kelly in another, me in the next. Same faces, same expressions, the same dead-eyed look staring out at us. None of us spoke as she continued to lay out the photos. It was like each picture took something from the room, something warm, something real. By the time she'd finished, there were 6 photos in total, and each one showed a version of us, all standing in front of the cabin, all staring with that same haunting expression. Then we found the final photo. I don't know who picked it up first, but the shock that rippled through us was almost physical. This one was different. It was the same group as before, yes, but the expressions had changed. Each face was twisted in fear, eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams, and behind them, barely visible, a shadowy figure loomed, tall and menacing, its face obscured. Steve dropped the photo like it burned him. "What the hell is this?" Sarah just shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't know. I found them here. I swear. I thought they were just old photos. But now..." We all looked at each other, feeling a creeping sense of dread. The photos were old, faded, yet they showed us, perfectly, unmistakably us, as if someone had taken them just yesterday. Kelly was the first to break.
"This is insane. There has to be an explanation. Maybe we look like some relatives of these people, or someone's just playing a sick joke on us."
But no one really believed that. Not after the last photo. Josh started pacing, his hand running through his hair, his face pale. Let's just get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "We'll leave tonight, drive back, forget any of this happened." He was halfway to the door when a loud bang echoed through the cabin, like something heavy had struck the outside wall. We all froze, staring at each other, our eyes wide, our breaths coming fast and shallow. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I didn't need to ask. It had been loud enough to shake the walls. Sarah moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, in the darkness, something shifted, something tall and thin, just at the edge of the tree line. She let out a gasp, stumbling back from the window, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. She looked at me, her eyes wide and unblinking.
There's someone out there, watching us."
Steve grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter, his hand trembling. "This is insane. Maybe it's just a local or some hiker. I'll go take a look." "Are you crazy?" Kelly hissed, grabbing his arm. "You go out there, and you're as good as dead. You saw those photos. Whoever, whatever, is in them. It's outside." The words hung in the air, and I could see Steve wavering. He didn't go outside, though. Instead, he turned off the flashlight and stepped back from the window, his expression grim. Another bang shook the cabin, louder this time, closer, as if it had come from the front door. We all jumped, our eyes darting toward the sound. Then we heard it, a faint scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood, moving along the outer walls of the cabin. It circled us, slowly, deliberately, and each of us shrank back, pressing ourselves against the walls, our breath coming in shallow gasps. "Is there another way out?" Josh whispered, his face pale. Sarah shook her head. "Only the front door and the windows. But that thing's out there. We're trapped." We huddled together, listening to the sound moving around the cabin. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing added up. The photos, the figure outside, the noise, it was all surreal, like some kind of nightmare come to life. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, so heavy I could feel it pressing down on my chest. Josh let out a shaky breath. "Maybe it's gone." No one responded. We were all too afraid to even move. But then, slowly, I heard it. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving toward the front door. The doorknob rattled, and we all froze, our eyes glued to it. The doorknob twisted slowly, and the door creaked open an inch, just enough for us to see a face peering in, shadowed and indistinct, but unmistakably one of the faces from the last photograph, the one filled with silent screams. We all backed away, our hearts pounding, as the door swung open wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And that was when I noticed the stack of photos, neatly placed back on the table. But now, there was an extra photo on top. It showed us. I reached out, my hand trembling. and picked up the new photo. It was a fresh picture, sharp, detailed, with none of the faded edges of the others. And in it, there we were. 5 terrified faces staring out at the camera, frozen in fear, just as we were now. But it wasn't just the 5 of us. In the background, barely visible, stood a shadowy figure, a dark, looming presence behind us. Its face was still a blur, as if it were slipping between reality and the darkness. Its hand rested on Sarah's shoulder. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice a broken, hollow sound as she stepped back from the table. "No, this isn't possible. We didn't take this picture." "Then who did?" Josh's voice was barely a whisper. Steve's hand clenched around the flashlight, and he looked at each of us, desperate, searching for answers that weren't there. "We're being hunted," he said finally, his voice shaking. "This thing, whatever it is, it's been watching us, following us, and now it's here." I felt a chill run down my spine, and I forced myself to look around the cabin, half expecting to see it standing in the shadows, watching us even now. But the room was empty, save for us, the fire's glow flickering on the walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows as if it wanted in. Kelly sank into a chair, her face pale, her eyes empty. "I don't understand. Why us? We're just people. We haven't done anything wrong." Sarah took a shaky breath. "Maybe that's why. Maybe it doesn't matter what we've done. Maybe it just wants us." "No," I said, trying to hold on to some sense of control, some rational explanation. "This isn't random. Think about it. Those photos. It's like it's showing us something, telling us something." Steve frowned, his brow furrowing. "Telling us what?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "I don't know. But maybe if we figure it out, we can get out of here." We all stared at each other, feeling that same twisted connection, that feeling that there was something deeper here, something we weren't seeing. I looked back down at the stack of photos, flipping through them one by one, hoping for a clue. The people in the old pictures looked like us, but not exactly. Subtle differences, the tilt of a head, the shape of a smile, the way they looked at each other. And in each photo, that shadow, that same menacing presence, loomed behind them, watching, waiting. As I flipped to the last one, the fresh photo of us with the shadow, I noticed something new. A line of smudged writing across the bottom, faded, but still readable. "It always ends the same." A cold wave of dread washed over me. "It always ends the same," I read aloud, my voice a mere whisper. The words felt heavy, final, as if they'd been written just for us. Josh was the first to react. "That's it. I'm not waiting around here for this thing to get us." He turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. "Josh, wait!" I started, but it was too late. He threw open the door and took a step out, into the dark. For a moment, all was silent. We held our breath, waiting, hoping he'd come back. But then came a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent a spike of terror straight through my chest. Josh's scream followed, sharp and cut short, and then silence. The dark outside felt deeper, hungrier, like it had swallowed him whole. Kelly screamed, covering her mouth, backing away from the door. "It's killing us. We have to get out of here. We can't just stay and wait to die." Sarah grabbed her arm, her face pale but determined. "No, we have to think. Running didn't save Josh. We need to understand what it wants, why it's doing this. There has to be a reason." Desperation filled the room. Steve moved to the windows, pulling back the curtains and peering into the darkness. We're surrounded. This thing is everywhere, in the woods, watching us. There's no escape out there. That was when I noticed the last photo on the table. A new one, though none of us had touched a camera, much less taken another picture. It showed the cabin from the outside, each window filled with our terrified faces, and a new note scribbled on the bottom. Only one leaves. The words felt like a challenge, a final twisted rule to a game none of us understood. My heart pounded as the meaning sank in. Only one of us would make it out of here. One, if any. Kelly was the first to break down, her voice hysterical. I'm not dying here. I'm not going to be its next victim. She ran for the door, but before any of us could stop her, she was gone, disappearing into the shadows outside. Moments later, a scream tore through the air, sharp and raw, before cutting off abruptly. I looked at Sarah and Steve. The three of us left, huddled together in the dark, terror pooling between us. I could see the realization in their eyes, the same twisted understanding settling into mine. The cabin wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was feeding off us, playing with us. And now it wanted to watch us turn on each other. I felt a shift in the room, an unspoken agreement hanging between us. One of us had to survive, had to make it out. The question was, who? Sarah's eyes darted toward the fireplace poker, her hand twitching. But Steve was faster. He lunged for it, swinging it between us, his face wild, desperate. Stay back, he warned, his voice barely a whisper. But I didn't move. None of us did. We were frozen in place, locked in a twisted standoff. I felt the pressure building, a dark, malevolent energy that seemed to swell and throb in the air around us, urging us forward, feeding off our fear. Then, in one swift, desperate motion, Sarah lunged. There was a struggle, a scream, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, it was just me. The others lay still, their faces twisted in fear, lifeless on the cabin floor. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. The cabin felt darker, colder, as if the shadows were closing in. And then, as if in response, the door creaked open, revealing the empty woods beyond, silent and waiting. I took a step forward, then another, feeling the pull of the outside, the taste of freedom just beyond reach. I was the last one, the only one left. I'd won. As I stepped out into the dark, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the window, shadows flickering, faces watching me from inside. They looked just like us. I turned away, swallowing hard, and started walking, the trees closing in around me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The cabin was done with me. But even as I walked away, I could still hear it, faint and distant, like a whisper in the wind. It always ends the same. And in that moment, I knew, somehow, some way, I'd be back. I knew it was a mistake to come to the cabin the moment we arrived. But then again, I'm usually the paranoid one in the group. It was supposed to be a celebration. 10 of us gathered together to honor Eric's newest bestseller, the novel that had launched him from struggling writer to literary darling overnight. I hadn't seen him or the rest of our circle in over a year, but the invitation was handwritten, a personal touch I couldn't say no to. Eric always had that way about him, like every word he wrote or spoke had been crafted just for you. The cabin itself was deep in the Adirondacks, nestled in a forest so thick it felt like you'd stepped into another world. It was picturesque, if you ignored the creeping sense of isolation. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the lake nearby shimmered under the last rays of daylight as we hauled our luggage up the creaky wooden steps. "Someplace, huh?" Jake said, whistling low as he looked around. His voice bounced off the walls of the forest, swallowed up by the trees. He was tall, all muscle and boyish charm, but even he looked a little uneasy. "Eric sure knows how to pick a spot." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Perfect for a murder mystery weekend." Jake laughed, but it sounded thin, nervous. We both knew it wasn't just the remoteness of the place that had us on edge. It was the fact that Eric wasn't here to greet us. The man of the hour was nowhere to be found. We all gathered in the cabin's main room. Me, Jake, Melissa, Simon, Priya, Claire, and a few of Eric's other literary friends. People I didn't know well enough to trust. The atmosphere was thick with confusion and unease. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, but it didn't warm the cold knot in my stomach. "Where the hell is Eric?" Melissa asked, her voice sharp. She'd always been the practical one, never afraid to voice what the rest of us were thinking. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture that made her look more defensive than confident. Simon shrugged, but there was a tightness around his eyes. "Maybe he's running late," he offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "He invited us," Priya pointed out, her dark eyes narrowing. "Why would he be late to his own celebration? It doesn't make any sense." We all exchanged uneasy glances, and that's when we heard it. A faint, static-filled sound coming from one of the old radios set up on a side table. It clicked on by itself, the dials turning with a screech that made my teeth ache. The static gave way to a voice, a recording, low and hollow, like it had been made in a place where the air was too thin to breathe. "I never finished my letter," the voice whispered. It was Eric's voice. "And now it's too late." Melissa let out a strangled gasp, and Jake moved toward the radio, his jaw clenched. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, but no one had an answer. The recording continued, crackling with each word. "It was a confession," Eric's voice went on, sounding haunted, broken. "Something you all needed to hear, but I waited too long. I waited until the shadows caught up to me. And now, they're coming for you." The radio clicked off with a snap, plunging the room into a heavy silence. For a moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the wind brushing against the windows, like ghostly fingers tapping to be let in. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "It has to be a prank, right? Eric's idea of fun?" But even she didn't believe that. None of us did. There was something too raw, too real in Eric's voice, and it had sent shivers down my spine. "Maybe he's trying to scare us," Simon suggested, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. "You know, to promote his next book or something." "No," Priya said firmly. "I know Eric. He wouldn't do this. Not for a joke." Before anyone could respond, a low, rhythmic thudding echoed from upstairs, as if something, or someone, was knocking on the floorboards from beneath the second story. We all froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks. Jake grabbed the fire poker, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay here," he muttered, though his hand was trembling. He moved toward the stairs, and despite my better judgment, I followed him. The others huddled together, whispering in nervous tones, but I couldn't just sit there. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we ascended, and the air grew colder the higher we went. I could see my breath in front of me, little puffs of fog, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when mixed with fear. We reached the landing and found the door to Eric's writing room slightly ajar. The thudding had stopped, but a chill seeped out from the crack, like the room itself was breathing frost. Jake shot me a look, and I nodded, though my heart felt like it was about to pound out of my chest. He pushed the door open, and we both stepped inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it from our college days, cluttered with books and papers, the walls lined with shelves sagging under the weight of old novels. But now, there was something different, something I couldn't quite place until I noticed the desk. Eric's typewriter sat there, an ancient, heavy thing, and in front of it was a sheet of paper, half-typed, the ink fresh and smudged. Jake stepped closer, his grip tightening on the fire poker. "What is it?" he whispered. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the unfinished words on the page. My blood ran cold as I read them. "They know what you did. They remember." Before I could process what that meant, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the windows. I whirled around, but the hallway outside was empty. Just shadows, stretching long and thin in the flickering light. "Jesus," Jake breathed, his voice cracking. "What the hell is going on?" But I couldn't answer. My eyes had been drawn to the window, where something had shifted in the darkness. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the gathering night. It was tall, impossibly thin, with eyes that seemed to glow a dull, hungry yellow. Then it was gone, melting into the woods like a nightmare fading into the dawn. A crash came from downstairs, followed by screams, and Jake and I bolted back toward the noise. My mind was racing, my breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a prank, and it wasn't some literary stunt. Eric had tried to warn us, and now, whatever he had feared was coming for us, too. You said, "Begin story 4. ChatGPT said, "ChatGPT. Here's the beginning of the cursed diary, told in first person with an ominous, suspenseful tone. The rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold, soaking us to the bone as we stumbled through the woods. Branches clawed at our clothes and scratched our faces, but we pushed forward, each of us desperate to find shelter before the storm swallowed us whole. It was supposed to be a hiking trip, a simple weekend getaway with friends. 5 of us, eager to escape the stress of our daily lives. Instead, it had turned into a fight against the elements, the sky cracking open above us in a roar of thunder. I was the one who spotted the cabin first, a dark silhouette tucked into a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me, momentarily pushing aside the cold and exhaustion. "There," I shouted over the storm, pointing. My voice sounded thin and small, barely carrying over the wind. We made our way to it, practically tripping over each other in our haste. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and dark, with a sagging porch that looked like it had seen better days. Ivy curled around the corners, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking back and forth in the wind. "We can't just barge in," Sophie said, though she was shivering so hard she could barely get the words out. She stood next to me, her dark hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with anxiety. "It's this or freeze out here," Mark replied, already stepping onto the porch. He was always the bold one, the kind of guy who thrived on adrenaline, but even he looked unnerved. "If someone's inside, we'll apologize." He pushed the door open, and we followed, too exhausted to argue. The cabin's interior was dark and cold, with shadows pooling in every corner. Our flashlights carved out little slices of light, illuminating a rustic room with a dusty old sofa, a stone fireplace filled with ash, and a wooden table that wobbled under the weight of an old oil lamp. The place smelled of damp wood and decay, as though it had been abandoned for years. "At least we're out of the rain," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. She rubbed her arms, trying to warm herself. Her blonde hair was tangled, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Ben, our quiet and ever-practical friend, had already started gathering wood from a small pile by the fireplace. "I'll try to get a fire going," he said, his tone even and calm despite the situation. I set my backpack down, feeling my muscles ache with exhaustion. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something on the wooden table, a thick, leather-bound book, worn and cracked, as though it had been handled 1,000 times. It was sitting in the center of the table, surrounded by a thin layer of dust, except for where a handprint had been pressed into its surface, fresh and clear. "Hey," I said, gesturing toward it. "Check this out." Sophie stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the cover. There were no words, no title, just that dark, aged leather. But it gave me a bad feeling, a crawling sensation at the back of my neck. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice was tight with unease. Mark, now standing over us, shrugged. "Just an old book. Maybe it belonged to whoever used to live here." Curiosity got the better of me, and before I could second-guess myself, I reached out and opened it. The pages were thick and yellowed, covered in spidery handwriting that twisted and looped across the paper. The ink was faded, but I could still make out the first line. "Those who read these words will come to know my fate, and in doing so, they will invite the curse upon themselves." A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand back, as if the diary had burned me. It's a journal or something," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Mark leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "A curse? Really? That's some Blair Witch stuff right there." But there was something in his voice, something that betrayed the forced bravado. He didn't like it either. Ben managed to get the fire going, and the flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the whole cabin seem alive, moving and shifting. The warmth felt good, but it did nothing to ease the cold pit of fear that had settled in my stomach. Rachel hugged herself, looking around uneasily. "We shouldn't be here," she said. "This place feels wrong." Before anyone could respond, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind us, making us all jump. The fire sputtered, and the room seemed to grow darker for a moment, the shadows deepening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Sophie grabbed my arm. Did anyone else hear that?" "Hear what?" Mark asked, but his voice was strained, as though he already knew the answer. I strained my ears, and that's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the cabin, far beyond the reach of our flashlights. Rachel's eyes widened, and she took a step closer to the fire. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Now." "Leave and go where?" Ben asked, his voice still calm, but his hands shaking. "The storm is only getting worse. We're safer here." But even he didn't sound convinced. The scratching grew louder, and we all fell silent, listening. It was steady, methodical, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced back at the cursed diary on the table, the words from that first page repeating in my mind. "Those who read these words." Mark grabbed the book, flipping through the pages, his face pale. "Maybe it's just a story," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Some old folk tale to scare people away." "Or maybe it's real," Sophie shot back. her eyes wide with fear. Maybe we've done exactly what it warned us not to do. Before anyone could argue further, the fire suddenly roared higher, the flames twisting into unnatural shapes, almost as if something was moving through them. The room grew colder, and the scratching noise stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the whole world had paused. Then, from somewhere deep in the cabin, a voice called out, a low, echoing whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come." We all froze, staring at each other, and for a moment, no one breathed. The voice had sounded close, too close, but the cabin was empty, wasn't it? "Who's there?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking, but there was no answer. Only the crackle of the fire and the pounding of rain against the windows. The shadows seemed to shift again, and I felt something cold brush against my arm, like a whisper of air or the touch of invisible fingers. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing behind me. Sophie was crying now, her hands pressed to her mouth. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. "Please, let's just leave." But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. We had awakened something ancient and angry, and it wasn't going to let us go so easily. The diary had warned us, but we hadn't listened. Now, we were trapped, and whatever was out there in the darkness was coming for us. Slowly, I turned to face the others, my voice hollow. "We read the words," I said, "and now the curse is real." The fire flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and danced. Somewhere in the darkness, the whispering voice returned, a promise and a threat. "It's too late to run." And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that we were in far more danger than we could ever have imagined. The cabin felt like a living thing, creaking and groaning as if the old wood itself resented our presence. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting wild shadows across our pale faces. For a moment, no one moved. We were frozen, trapped by the oppressive weight of fear, listening for that voice to return. Rachel was the first to break the silence, her voice cracking. "We need to get out of here. I don't care about the storm. I'd rather risk that than stay here with whatever this is." Her words jolted us into motion. Mark, who still held the cursed diary in his hands, glanced around, looking for support. His fingers tightened around the leather cover. "We can't just run blindly into the woods," he said, though his own voice was shaky. "If we get lost out there, we could freeze or get hurt." "Better than staying here," Sophie said, her voice rising hysterically. "You heard it. Something is in this cabin, and it knows we're here." Ben, who had always been the calm, rational one, tried to steady his breathing, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. Maybe we should try to reason with it," he suggested, but even he didn't seem convinced. "Reason with it?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "Ben, whatever it is, it doesn't want to talk. It wants us gone or worse." Another gust of wind rattled the windows, and we all jumped, turning toward the sound. I kept expecting the door to burst open, for some shadowy figure to step inside and claim us. The scratching had stopped, but the silence felt even more ominous, as though something was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mark finally seemed to snap. "Fine, we'll leave," he said, dropping the diary back onto the table like it was poisonous. "We'll take our chances with the storm. Anything's better than staying in this haunted hellhole." He turned toward the door, and we all began to follow, driven by a desperate need to escape. But as we reached the entrance, the door slammed shut on its own, the force of it shaking the cabin. We stared at it, dumbfounded, and Mark grabbed the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling with all his strength. The door was sealed tight, as though something was holding it closed from the other side. He rammed his shoulder against it, but it didn't even shudder. "It won't let us leave," Rachel whispered, her voice full of dread. "We're trapped." Panic was starting to set in, and I could feel the cabin pressing in around us, the walls seeming to inch closer, suffocating. The shadows flickered and twisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching us from every corner, hidden and malevolent. Sophie collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. "This isn't happening. This can't be real." But it was real. The curse, the voice, the door refusing to open, all of it was horribly, impossibly real. I knelt down beside her, trying to comfort her, even though I was shaking just as hard. Hey, I said softly, though my voice cracked. "We'll get out of this. We just have to stay calm." "Calm?" she snapped, lifting her tear-streaked face to glare at me. "How can you say that when we're trapped in a haunted cabin with a curse?" I didn't have an answer. The only thing I could do was try to steady my own breathing, to keep myself from falling into the same spiral of fear. But then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, the fire in the hearth sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. The shadows swallowed us whole, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our ragged breathing. Then, the whisper returned, this time closer, almost as if it were right beside us. "You should have left while you could." I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight trembling as I swung it around the room. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty chairs and a cold, empty hearth. But then the beam landed on the diary. It was lying open now, pages fluttering as though moved by an invisible hand. The writing, once spidery and faded, was changing right before our eyes, new words etching themselves into the paper in dark, angry lines. "1 by 1, you'll pay." A scream erupted from Rachel, and I turned to see her stumbling back, clutching her arm. Blood trickled through her fingers, and I realized with horror that something had slashed her, an unseen force leaving 3 deep gouges in her skin.
"It hurt me!"
she shrieked, panic overwhelming her.
"Something's in here with us!"
Ben rushed to her side, trying to staunch the bleeding with a torn piece of his shirt. "We need to do something," he said, his calm facade cracking. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to kill us." I looked around the cabin, desperate for any kind of answer. The diary seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the words on its pages shifting, twisting. The air felt thick with something heavy, a presence that was growing stronger by the second. "We need to put the diary back," I blurted out, my mind grasping at straws. "Maybe if we return it to where we found it, the curse will break." Mark shook his head. "Where the hell are we supposed to put it? It was just lying there on the table when we got here." Sophie's sobs quieted for a moment, and she wiped her face with trembling hands. "Wait, when we came in, did anyone notice that trapdoor?" We all turned to look where she was pointing. There, half hidden under an old rug, was a wooden trapdoor set into the floor. It was ancient, with rusted hinges and a heavy iron handle. "I didn't see it before," Ben whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It was covered." I felt a shiver run through me. It was as though the cabin itself had revealed it, as though we were being led to something we weren't supposed to find. But there was no other choice. If the diary was the key to breaking the curse, we had to try. Mark grabbed the handle and pulled, and the trapdoor creaked open, revealing a dark, yawning hole beneath. A foul, earthy smell wafted up, making me gag, and I shone my flashlight down into the abyss. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see the outline of a narrow wooden ladder leading into the unknown. "Are you serious?" Rachel demanded, clutching her injured arm. "You want us to go down there?" "What other choice do we have?" I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "If this is the only way to end it." Ben nodded, though his face was pale. "We do it together. We don't split up." Sophie clung to me as we made our way to the trap door, and I could feel her trembling. I reached for the diary, the cursed object that had brought this nightmare upon us, and tucked it under my arm. My hands felt clammy, and the leather cover seemed to pulse against my skin, like a heartbeat. One by one, we descended into the darkness, the ladder groaning under our weight. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay grew stronger, like something ancient and rotting had been waiting down there for a long, long time. When my feet touched solid ground, I shone my flashlight around. We were in a small earthen chamber, the walls lined with old, crumbling stones. Symbols were etched into the walls, strange and twisted, as though they'd been carved with shaking hands. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and my heart sank at the sight of it. It was covered in the same spidery handwriting as the diary, words scrawled in dark, dried blood. I stepped forward, clutching the book tightly, and placed it on the altar. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air growing still and heavy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to shake, a low rumbling that made the walls tremble. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent, as though 100 voices were speaking at once. The symbols on the walls glowed a sickly green, and the diary began to burn, the leather curling and charring. "We need to get out of here," Mark shouted, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away from the diary as it turned to ash. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. The light faded, and the air grew still. I turned to the others, my breath catching in my throat. Had we broken the curse? Or had we just woken something far, far worse? The answer came in the form of a low, echoing laugh that rose from the shadows. The whispers had returned, more powerful than before, and I realized with dawning horror that the cabin, and whatever lay beneath it, wasn't done with us yet. The rain had been coming down in a relentless torrent for hours by the time we found the cabin. My clothes were soaked through, my boots squelching with every step, and every breath I took felt thick with cold and fatigue. We'd gotten lost somewhere along the hiking trail, and what was supposed to be a scenic weekend trip had turned into a desperate search for shelter. "There," Mark shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind and pounding rain. He pointed ahead, where a dark shape loomed out of the forest, a small, decrepit cabin, barely visible through the sheets of rain. "Thank God," Sophie muttered, pushing her drenched hair out of her face. She was shivering, her lips pale and trembling, and I knew we couldn't stay out in this much longer. The 5 of us, me, Mark, Sophie, Rachel, and Ben, stumbled toward the cabin, practically collapsing onto the sagging wooden porch. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows were dusty and cracked, and ivy had begun to creep up the sides like greedy fingers. But it was dry, and that was enough for now. Mark didn't even hesitate before pushing the door open. It swung inward with a groan, and we hurried inside, grateful to be out of the storm. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading light filtering through the dirty windows. It was a single room, sparsely furnished, a wooden table, a few rickety chairs, an ancient-looking fireplace filled with cold ash, and shelves lined with objects I couldn't make out.
This place is
Creepy, Rachel said, wrinkling her nose. Her voice echoed slightly, bouncing off the bare walls. But at least it's dry. Ben was already pulling off his soaked jacket and trying to wring it out. We'll have to wait out the storm here, he said, glancing around. Let's hope it doesn't last all night. I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them, and took in our surroundings. The cabin smelled of old wood and mildew, with a faint metallic tang that I couldn't quite place. It felt like the kind of place that had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the heart of the forest. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, long and heavy, like they had been waiting for company. Sophie walked over to the table and frowned. "Hey, look at this," she said, pointing. We all gathered around to see what she'd found. There, in the center of the table, was a thick, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, the leather cracked and peeling at the edges, and a large clasp held it shut. Dust coated the cover, but someone, or something, had dragged a finger through it, leaving a smear behind. "Is that a diary?" Mark asked, reaching for it. "Don't touch it," Rachel said quickly, grabbing his arm. Her voice was tense, and I could see the unease in her eyes. "We shouldn't mess with anything in here." Mark hesitated, but curiosity won out. He pulled his arm free and undid the clasp with a snap. The sound echoed through the cabin, and I swear the temperature dropped a few degrees. He flipped the book open, and we all leaned in, trying to read the spidery handwriting that filled the pages. The ink was dark and old, the letters looping and twisting in a way that made my eyes ache. The first entry was dated over a century ago, and it began with a warning. "Those who read these words are bound by them. My sins are yours now. My fate is your own." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Mark shrugged, though his expression was uneasy. "Probably just some old superstition. You know, people used to believe in curses and stuff." Ben frowned, peering at the text. "This is a bad idea," he said. "We shouldn't be reading this." But Mark ignored him, flipping to another page. The entries were short, fragmented, as if the writer had been in a hurry or terrified. "The shadows grow longer. They whisper my name at night. I cannot leave. The forest holds me here, a prisoner in this cursed place. I tried to burn the diary, but it would not catch flame. It will not let me go." Sophie shivered, stepping back from the table. "This is seriously creepy," she said. "Let's just put it away and wait for the storm to pass." But Mark seemed mesmerized. He kept flipping through the pages, his brow furrowed. "It's just a story," he said, trying to sound casual. "Some old journal from a crazy hermit or something." Then he stopped, his face draining of color. "Wait, look at this," he said, his voice shaking. We all leaned in again, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The most recent entry was different, newer, the ink still sharp and dark, and it was dated with today's date. "They have arrived. They have read the words. Now, they are mine." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the fireless hearth seemed to exhale a cold breath. We all stumbled back from the table, the diary sitting there like a malevolent thing, radiating a sense of wrongness that I couldn't explain. "Okay, that's enough," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't," Rachel said, pointing at the window. The storm outside had only grown worse, the rain lashing against the glass with such force I thought it might shatter. "We'll be lost if we try to go out there." Sophie's hands were trembling. "What did we just do?" she whispered. Before anyone could answer, the cabin creaked, the sound deep and mournful, like a living thing waking up. The shadows along the walls seemed to thicken, pooling in the corners, and a faint scratching noise began, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. We all exchanged wide-eyed looks, panic rising. The scratching grew louder, and the whole cabin seemed to groan in response. The diary's pages began to flutter on their own, as though caught in an invisible wind. The shadows seemed to reach out from the walls, stretching toward us, and a voice, a low, rasping whisper, echoed through the cabin. "You have read the words. You cannot escape." The room plunged into chaos. Sophie screamed, and Mark stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Ben grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" he shouted. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadows were closing in, and the diary lay on the table, its pages flipping and whispering like it was alive. We had awakened something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for a long time. And now, it was coming for us. The shadows twisted around the room, growing darker, denser, as if they were breathing, closing in on us. My flashlight flickered, and in the bursts of light, I could see faces forming in the dark. Hollow, skeletal outlines with empty eyes that seemed to follow our every move. The voice, that low, rasping whisper, grew louder. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, pressing against my ears, sinking into my skin. "You are bound by the curse. There is no escape." Sophie was sobbing now, clutching Rachel's arm, her face pale with terror. Mark had backed into the wall, his eyes wide and wild as he stared at the diary, as if hoping it would somehow make sense if he just looked hard enough. Ben gripped my shoulder, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Did you see that?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "In the corner, by the fireplace. Something moved." I swung my flashlight in that direction, the beam sputtering as if something was trying to snuff it out. For a second, I thought I saw something, a shadow that didn't belong, taller than any of us, shifting like smoke. Mark snapped out of his daze and lunged for the diary, slamming it shut. The moment the cover closed, the whispering stopped, the shadows pulling back slightly. The room fell into a tense, echoing silence. We stood there, hearts pounding, barely daring to breathe. Did that stop it?" Sophie asked, her voice small, as if she didn't really believe it. Mark shook his head, his hands trembling as he held the diary. "I don't know, but we have to get rid of this thing." "How?" Ben demanded, his voice cracking. "It said it can't be destroyed. The person who wrote it tried to burn it, and it didn't work." Rachel clung to Sophie, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't just wait here for that thing to come back. There has to be a way to break the curse." I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something sliding across the floor, slow and deliberate. My flashlight beam jerked in that direction, but there was nothing there. Just the old wooden boards and the faint outline of the trapdoor that led to the cabin's cellar. The trapdoor. It hadn't been open when we arrived, but now it was cracked slightly, as if something had pushed it from below. "What's down there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to look, and the fear on their faces deepened. The trapdoor creaked open a bit more, just a fraction of an inch, and a foul, rotting smell wafted up from the darkness below. The scratching noise began again, louder this time, echoing from the depths. Mark stumbled backward, clutching the diary to his chest. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No way. I'm not going down there." But the diary seemed to disagree. The clasp on the cover snapped open on its own, and the pages began to flip wildly, faster and faster, until they stopped on a new entry, one that hadn't been there before. Return to the source. Only then will the curse be broken. I could barely breathe. The source, I repeated, my throat tight. It wants us to go down there. The shadows began to shift again, seeping from the corners, crawling toward us like inky fingers. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath coming out in white clouds, and the voice returned, louder, more insistent. Go. Go now. Rachel clung to Sophie, her eyes wild with terror. It's going to kill us if we don't do what it says, she said, desperation cracking her voice. We have to try. Ben swallowed hard, looking from the trap door to the diary and back again. This is insane, he whispered. We could be walking right into a death trap. Do we have another choice? I asked, my voice shaking. If we stay here, it'll get us anyway. At least down there, we have a chance. Mark's face was pale, but he nodded, clutching the diary like a lifeline. Fine, he said. We go together. No one splits up. Slowly, we made our way to the trap door. The stench of decay grew stronger, almost overpowering, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Ben pulled the trapdoor open all the way, and the darkness below seemed to breathe, cold and damp. I went first, descending the narrow wooden ladder into the abyss. The wood groaned under my weight, and I half expected it to snap, sending me plunging into the unknown. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom, illuminating a dirt floor and walls lined with ancient, crumbling stone. The smell was even worse down here, thick and suffocating. One by one, the others followed, their faces pale and drawn in the weak light. We stood huddled together, our breaths coming fast, our fear a living, pulsing thing between us. The scratching was louder now, coming from the far side of the cellar, where the darkness seemed thicker, almost solid. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it in that direction, and that's when I saw it. Something was moving in the shadows. A figure, tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, its face hidden in darkness. It stepped forward, and the light seemed to bend around it, refusing to touch the thing fully. But I could see its eyes, two pinpricks of cold, pale light, staring right at us. Sophie let out a choked sob, and Rachel clamped a hand over her own mouth to keep from screaming. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just watched, and the air around us grew colder, the sense of wrongness suffocating. Mark's hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold on to the diary. What do you want? He whispered. The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the very walls of the cellar, it spoke. You brought it here. You read the words. Now, you must give it back. The diary, the source of the curse. Mark swallowed hard and stepped forward, holding out the diary. His hand was trembling, his knuckles white. Take it, he said, his voice cracking. Just take it, and leave us alone. The figure's eyes seemed to burn brighter, and it reached out with one long, bony hand. Its fingers curled around the diary, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, the thing's grip tightened, and Mark let out a strangled cry as he was pulled forward, yanked off his feet. Mark! I screamed, lunging for him. But it was too late. The thing dragged him into the shadows, and his screams echoed around us, cutting off abruptly. Sophie and Rachel were sobbing now, and Ben grabbed my arm, his face pale with terror. We have to get out of here, he said, his voice breaking. But the shadows were closing in, swirling around us, and I realized with a cold, sinking feeling that there was no escape. The diary was gone, but the curse was still here, alive and hungry. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us was the figure, its eyes blazing, and the shadows reaching out like a living thing, pulling us down into the blackness. And then there was nothing. We didn't plan on stopping at the cabin. The storm forced our hand. What had started as a scenic winter hike, a weekend away from the hustle of the city, had turned into a fight for survival as the temperature plummeted and snow fell harder than I'd ever seen. The flakes came down in thick, suffocating sheets, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The cold clawed at our skin, relentless and biting, and I knew we had to find shelter or risk freezing to death. "Over there!" Emily shouted, her voice muffled by her scarf and the winds howling. She pointed to a dark shape emerging from the blizzard, a small, weathered cabin that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. "Thank God," Josh muttered, his breath coming out in white clouds. He stumbled toward it, nearly tripping in the snow, and I followed, my hands numb even inside my thick gloves. It was me, Josh, Emily, and Ryan. 4 friends who had thought we could handle anything the wilderness threw at us. Now, our laughter and light-hearted banter felt like a lifetime ago, replaced by an overwhelming sense of urgency. We made it to the cabin, shoving the door open with our combined weight. It creaked and groaned, protesting against the wind, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The sudden silence was deafening. The howling wind was muffled, reduced to a low, ominous whisper that slipped through the cracks in the wood. I shook the snow from my jacket and stomped my boots, trying to bring life back into my frozen limbs. Emily was already rubbing her hands together, her face red from the cold, while Ryan worked on building a fire in the small stone hearth. The cabin was sparse and simple. A table, 4 chairs, a few dusty shelves, and that fireplace, which thankfully had a small pile of wood stacked nearby. "Whoever owns this place won't mind," Ryan muttered, striking a match. His hands were trembling, but the flame caught, and soon a weak fire flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the wooden walls. "If we stay here, we'll live to thank them." Emily nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She was staring around the cabin with a worried frown. "Does it feel warm to anyone else?" she asked. I paused, feeling the warmth from the fire slowly seep into my bones. But she was right. The cabin had been freezing when we walked in, but the air was already uncomfortably warm, almost stifling, despite the howling storm outside. "Maybe the insulation's better than it looks," Josh suggested, though he sounded doubtful. "Yeah," I said, trying to ignore the sense of unease that settled over me. "We'll be fine." But then I noticed something else. The table. It was set with 4 plates and 4 cups, all arranged neatly, as if someone had been expecting us. The food on the plates had long since rotted away, leaving behind a dark, moldy residue, but the arrangement was disturbingly perfect. "Guys," I called, my voice tight, "come look at this." The others joined me, and Josh let out a low whistle. "That's unsettling." "Maybe the owners left in a hurry," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. He reached out and touched one of the plates, then jerked his hand back. "It's warm," he whispered, his eyes wide. Emily's frown deepened. "What do you mean, warm?" "Feel it yourself," Ryan said, and Emily hesitated before pressing her fingers to one of the plates. Her face went pale. "He's right. It's warm, like someone was just here." A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I forced a laugh. "It's probably just the heat from the fire," I said, though even I could hear the waver in my voice. But it wasn't just the plates. The whole cabin felt wrong. The walls seemed to press in on us, and the shadows cast by the fire danced too wildly, as if they had minds of their own. The warmth was almost oppressive, and I found myself sweating, despite the blizzard raging just outside. "I don't like this," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We should leave." "Into the storm?" Josh asked, shaking his head. "We'll die out there." The cabin gave a sudden deep groan, like the wood itself was in pain, and we all froze. Then, somewhere in the distance, a noise echoed, a low, rhythmic thumping sound, like heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't dare breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear mirrored in everyone else's eyes. Then, softly, we heard something else, a faint, melodic whisper drifting through the cracks in the cabin walls. It sounded almost like singing, a haunting, ghostly lullaby carried on the wind. "What the hell is that?" Ryan whispered, his face pale. I shook my head, my throat tight with fear. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening feeling that it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the cabin, from somewhere just out of sight. Josh grabbed one of the chairs and shoved it under the doorknob, barricading it. "No one's getting in here," he said, though his voice was shaking. But the warmth in the cabin grew even stronger, almost suffocating, and I wiped sweat from my forehead. The shadows on the walls twisted, forming shapes that looked like figures, people standing and watching us. And then, with a slow, creaking groan, the door to a small back room swung open. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but I couldn't move. The door revealed nothing but darkness, a thick, impenetrable blackness that seemed to pulse and breathe. The singing stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers racing down my spine. "You were warned. Now, you must pay." The fire in the hearth suddenly flared, casting grotesque shadows across the room, and we stumbled back, terror flooding through us. The warmth became blistering, the heat pressing against our skin like invisible hands. Ryan backed away from the open door, his face pale. What did we do?" he stammered. Josh's eyes were wide with panic. "We need to leave. Now." But the cabin seemed to have other plans. The front door, the one we had come through, creaked and warped, the wood bending as though something massive was pushing against it. The shadows on the walls grew darker, thicker, and the oppressive heat made it impossible to breathe. Emily was crying now, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "We shouldn't have come here," she sobbed. "We shouldn't have stayed." The low whisper returned, echoing around us, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You will not leave." The floorboards beneath our feet groaned and cracked, and the entire cabin seemed to shudder, as if something ancient and angry was waking up. The darkness from the back room spread, creeping across the floor, reaching for us with long, inky tendrils. Josh grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We have to run," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "We can't stay here." But as I looked around, I knew it was too late. The cabin had trapped us, and the warmth, that suffocating heat, was only growing stronger. The shadows reached out, and the whisper became a roar. "You are mine." And then the darkness swallowed us whole. The darkness felt alive, pressing against us, suffocating, filling every corner of the cabin. My flashlight flickered, the beam dim and useless against the shadows that writhed and pulsed as if the cabin itself was breathing. The heat grew unbearable, sweat soaking through my clothes despite the freezing blizzard just outside. Josh's grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel him shaking. Emily was still sobbing, her cries echoing in the oppressive gloom, and Ryan stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The darkness from the open back room spilled across the floor like an ink stain, spreading toward us, reaching with shadowy tendrils. "We have to get out," Josh said, his voice cracking. "We have to." The front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the cabin shuddered around us. The wind howled outside, but it felt so far away, like a sound trapped on the other side of the world. I could barely breathe, the heat suffocating, as though the cabin were trying to squeeze the air from my lungs. The whispering returned, no longer distant and ghostly, but close, far too close. It was a chorus of voices, low and rumbling, filling the room like a warning. "You were warned. You did not listen." I stumbled back, my flashlight beam catching the edges of those twisted shadows that seemed to form faces, faces that grinned and sneered and melted back into the dark. My heart pounded, and I fought to keep from screaming, my voice lodged somewhere deep in my throat. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want from us?" The shadows paused, shifting and curling around us, as if considering my question. Then, from the back room, something stepped forward, emerging from the thick darkness. It was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long, its silhouette twisted and wrong. Its eyes glowed an unnatural white, piercing through the shadows, and its mouth stretched into a grin that seemed to split its face in half. It looked almost human, but warped, like a nightmare come to life. Emily's sobbing turned to a scream, and she stumbled backward, clutching at Ryan, who was too petrified to move. The figure tilted its head, and its voice, raspy and grating, like dead leaves scraping over ice, filled the room. "You entered this place," it whispered. "You ignored the warnings carved into the woods. Now, you are ours." "What warnings?" I choked out, fear making my voice hoarse. My mind raced, desperately trying to remember if we had missed something, anything that would have told us to turn back. But all I could remember were the trees, the snow, the storm. The thing's grin widened, and it took another step forward, the floorboards creaking under its weight. The shadows twisted around its form, almost as if they were part of it, moving with it, clinging to it. Ryan snapped out of his frozen terror, shoving Emily behind him. "We'll leave," he shouted, his voice breaking. "We didn't mean to disturb anything. Just let us go." The creature let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound that made my skin crawl. "You cannot leave," it said. "Once you cross the threshold, there is no escape. You are bound to this place, just as we are." Emily's scream turned into a low, keening wail, and I felt something cold touch the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just more shadows, more darkness. The sense of being surrounded, trapped, grew stronger, and I knew we couldn't fight this thing. We were at its mercy. Josh grabbed my shoulder, his eyes wide with desperation. "There has to be a way out," he whispered. "There has to be." Before he could finish, the floor beneath us cracked, splintering like ice on a frozen lake. We stumbled, and the cabin lurched, as if the entire structure was being pulled apart by invisible hands. The fire in the hearth flared, turning an unnatural blue, casting the room in a sickly cold light. The thing in the shadows moved closer, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. "You will never leave," it said. "Your fear feeds this place. Your terror keeps it alive." The cabin shuddered again, and the shadows lashed out, wrapping around Josh's legs like living vines. He screamed, trying to wrench himself free, but the darkness dragged him toward the back room, the inky blackness swallowing him whole. "Josh!" I screamed, lunging for him, but the shadows wrapped around my arms, holding me back. His screams echoed through the cabin, growing fainter and fainter, until they disappeared completely. Emily and Ryan were both sobbing now, and I struggled against the shadows, panic clawing at my chest. "Let him go!" I yelled, but the thing just laughed, the sound echoing through the room. The creature loomed over us, its eyes blazing white, and I realized with a sinking dread that it was growing stronger. Our fear was feeding it, just as it had said. Don't let it see your fear," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Don't give it what it wants." Emily tried to stifle her sobs, pressing a hand over her mouth, but the terror was too overwhelming. The creature tilted its head, as if amused, and then turned its gaze on Ryan. "You," it whispered, the shadows tightening around him. "You are next." Ryan let out a strangled cry, and I tried to reach for him, but the darkness was too strong. The shadows dragged him backward, his hands clawing at the floor, his eyes wide with terror. He disappeared into the blackness, his screams cut off as the cabin swallowed him whole. Emily fell to her knees, trembling, and I felt the hopelessness wash over me. The cabin was alive, a thing of darkness and hunger, and we were trapped in its grip. The creature stepped closer, its eyes glowing, and I knew we couldn't fight it. Not like this. But then, in a moment of desperation, I remembered something. An old story my grandmother had told me when I was a kid, about spirits and the power of names. If we could name the thing, if we could call it out, maybe we could break its hold. I forced myself to stand, the shadows still clinging to me, and faced the creature. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Tell us your name." The thing paused, and for a moment, the shadows wavered. Its grin faltered, and its eyes narrowed. "You do not know," it hissed, but I could hear the hint of fear in its voice. "I demand to know your name," I shouted, hoping, praying that this would work. The shadows loosened slightly, and the creature let out a furious, guttural snarl. "You cannot banish me," it growled, but it was shrinking, its form becoming less solid, less real. "Tell me your name!" I shouted again, louder this time, and the entire cabin shuddered. The shadows writhed and twisted, and the creature's form began to break apart, its grin turning into a grimace. "I am bound to this place," it hissed, "but you will never escape." The thing dissolved into darkness, and the cabin gave a final, violent shudder. The oppressive heat vanished, replaced by the bitter cold of the storm outside. The shadows receded, slithering back into the corners, and the door to the cabin creaked open, letting in the howling wind. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, my entire body shaking. Emily was still there, sobbing quietly, but Josh and Ryan were gone. The cabin was silent, empty, as if it had never been alive in the first place. We stumbled out into the storm, the freezing air biting at our skin, but I didn't care. We had escaped. We had survived. But as we fled through the snow, I could still hear the whisper, faint and distant, echoing from the cabin behind us. You will never escape. And deep down, I knew the truth. We had left the cabin, but a part of it had come with us, a shadow clinging to our souls. We had broken free, but we would never truly be safe. The cabin had claimed its victims, but its curse would haunt us forever.